It was a cold and lonely night, typical of a relentless winter. Sarah, a young woman with a kind heart, was returning from work later than usual. The streets were almost deserted, except for a solitary figure in the distance. As she approached, she noticed an elderly woman dressed in worn-out clothes, trembling with cold as she tried, unsuccessfully, to carry a heavy bag. The old woman seemed fragile, almost invisible as the shadows of the night enveloped her. Her eyes, however, had something disturbing about them, as if they carried a weight much greater than just years of life. With a hesitant smile, Sarah approached and offered help. "Can I carry that for you?" she asked, trying to ignore the chill that ran up her spine. The old woman accepted with an almost imperceptible nod, but her eyes locked onto Sarah with an intensity the young woman couldn't decipher. "Thank you so much, my dear," whispered the old woman, her voice sounding both grateful and weary. As they walked together, the city seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah tried to start a conversation, but the old woman said nothing. There was something strange about that silence, something that made Sarah's heart beat a little faster, but she forced herself not to think about it. After all, it was just a good deed, right? But as they approached a dark alley, the feeling that something was terribly wrong began to grow inside Sarah, like a shadow slowly spreading through her spirit. As they walked down the increasingly narrow and dark path, the old woman finally broke the silence with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep, almost like a whisper lost in the wind. "You are very kind, my dear," she said, looking directly into Sarah's eyes with a gaze that was both grateful and something else that Sarah couldn't identify, but it made her skin crawl. "I'm so tired and lonely," the old woman continued, her voice laden with an invisible weight. "Would it be too much to ask if you could accompany me to my house? It's not far from here, and I promise it won't take much of your time. Maybe you could even help me tidy up a few things. It would be so nice to have company, even if just for a moment." Sarah hesitated. The request seemed simple, even innocent, but there was something in the way the woman spoke, as if her words were wrapped in a veil of mystery, a layer that Sarah couldn't penetrate. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, but kindness and guilt began to intertwine in her heart. It wouldn't be right to leave her alone in this condition, she thought, trying to convince herself that she was just being sympathetic. "Sure, I can help you," Sarah replied, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. The old woman smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, my dear," she said with a softness that felt strangely threatening. "You won't regret it." With that, the old woman took the lead, guiding Sarah through a series of winding streets that seemed to grow darker and quieter with each step. The streetlights flickered as if they were about to go out, and the air seemed denser, harder to breathe. Sarah's heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears like a distant drum. She tried to shake off the growing fear, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks. But deep down, she knew she had crossed an invisible line, one from which there was no return. Unknowingly, Sarah had accepted much more than a simple offer of help. As the two moved further away from the part of the city Sarah knew as the busiest, the environment around them grew increasingly oppressive. The streets, once familiar, seemed to transform into dead ends, as if the very space around them was contorting to trap them. The windows of the few houses they passed were dark, and there was no longer the sound of footsteps or voices in the distance. It was as if the world had decided that, on this night, no one else existed, them. As they walked down a seemingly endless path, Sarah began to notice small details that made the fear grow inside her. First thing that caught her attention was the smell. A strange and unpleasant odor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a smell that reminded her of something rotten, as if the air was contaminated by an invisible, malevolent presence. Increasingly uneasy, Sarah tried to start a conversation again, hoping to relieve the tension that enveloped her like a thick fog. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice came out more tremulous than she expected. The old woman did not respond immediately, as if she were pondering something. When she finally spoke, her voice had a tone that Sarah could not decipher. It was almost satisfied. "Long enough to know the way well," the old woman replied, without even looking at Sarah. "But it's funny, the paths seem different at night, don't they?" That response made Sarah's stomach knot. There was no doubt that something was very wrong. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to get away, to run from there as fast as she could. But, for some reason, her feet continued to follow the old woman, as if they were bound to a fate she could no longer avoid. And then, the old woman did something that froze Sarah's blood. She abruptly stopped in front of an old, dilapidated house, the windows broken, and its walls covered in moss. "We've arrived," she said, a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Come in, my dear. There's much to do." Sarah stood frozen, watching the door of the house creak open as if it had been expecting her arrival. The darkness inside was palpable, almost alive, and at that moment, Sarah knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had made a terrible mistake. The door creaked slowly, revealing an interior that seemed pulled straight from a nightmare. The walls were stained with dampness, and the air was heavy, laden with a smell that Sarah could now clearly identify. It was the unmistakable odor of decay, as if something had died and been forgotten there. Each step she took felt like a deeper plunge into the darkness, and the sense of imminent danger wrapped around her like a second skin. The old woman entered first, moving with an agility that did not seem to match her frail appearance. "Follow me," she ordered, in a voice that sounded more authoritative, as if it did not accept refusal. Sarah hesitated, but something in those words seemed to pull her forward, as if she no longer had control over her own action. Each step was accompanied by the muffled sound of her own heart beating uncontrollably in her chest. The hallway they entered seemed to stretch as they advanced, the shadows on the walls appearing to move, dancing to a macabre rhythm. Tears of terror threatened to escape Sarah's eyes, but she kept following, unable to stop. It was as if she had been ensnared in an invisible web, trapped in a game whose outcome she could already foresee, but not avoid. At the end of the hallway, the old woman stopped before a door, more robust and imposing than the others. "Here we are," she said, with a smile that now clearly showed sharp, yellowed teeth, like those of a creature that fed on something far beyond what Sarah could imagine. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark room, lit only by candles that seemed to cast more shadows than light. Sarah took a step back, fear finally overflowing. I can't," she began to say, but the old woman extended her hand, gripping her with surprising strength. "You entered of your own free will," she whispered, with a tone of sadistic satisfaction. "Now, there's no turning back." With a tug, Sarah was dragged into the room. The door closed with a bang that echoed through the house, sealing her fate. At that moment, the young woman realized she had been led step by step directly into a deadly trap. Inside that room, the darkness seemed to have a life of its own, pulsing and contorting around Sarah like a malevolent presence. The candle flames flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, which seemed to move with a will of their own. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and each breath Sarah took sounded more like a muffled whimper. She tried to free herself from the old woman's bony hand, but it was as if her fingers were made of iron, impossible to pry loose. The old woman, now standing next to a table covered with a worn and dusty cloth, began to mutter something in an unknown language, a kind of dark chant that seemed to make the walls tremble. In the center of the table was an ancient box, adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the candlelight. "You have been chosen," said the old woman, her voice sounding like the creaking of rusty doors. "And now, game must begin." Before Sarah could comprehend what was happening, the old woman opened the box, revealing a set of objects that looked like they were taken directly from a dark ritual. A knife with a darkened blade, pieces of bones tied with red strings, a small mirror, whose surface reflected something that was not Sarah's face, but a distorted, terrifying version of it, as if showing her imprisoned soul. The old woman pulled the knife from the box, and gently placed it in Sarah's trembling hands, her eyes gleaming with unbearable malice. "To leave here alive, you must play," she said, with a smile that revealed the true nature of the being before Sarah. "But beware, game is treacherous, and the rules change according to the will of those who watch us." Sarah felt the cold blade in her trembling hands, and the realization that her life now depended on a game whose rules she did not understand began to take shape in her mind. Despair began to set in, but at the same time, a part of her wanted to fight, wanted to survive at all costs. But as she looked around, realizing that the shadows on the walls now seemed to be watching her with invisible eyes, she knew that any wrong move would be her last. The game had begun, and Sarah was about to discover that the price of the help she had accepted was much higher than she could have imagined. Sarah was paralyzed, holding the knife that felt as heavy as lead in her hands. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for an escape, but all she found were shadows, which now seemed to close in, shrinking the space around her. The old woman's chant continued, growing louder and more frantic, reverberating off the walls like an echo from another reality, one that Sarah did not want to know. Suddenly the chant stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The old woman approached, her eyes now glowing with a sinister light, as if consumed by an inner fire. "You trusted me," she said with a voice that sounded both familiar and strange, as if speaking through multiple mouths. "And now you must pay the price." With a swift motion, the old woman grabbed the mirror from the table and held it up in front of Sarah. The young woman couldn't help but look, and what she saw made her blood freeze. In the reflection, it wasn't just her face that appeared, but a version of her that seemed to be rotting from the inside out, as if something was devouring her essence. It was a vision of absolute despair. The more she looked, the more she felt something pulling her soul into the mirror, as if being sucked into a bottomless abyss. "This is the reflection of your trust," murmured the old woman, with malicious satisfaction. "You opened the door for me, for this world, and now you must face the consequence." Sarah tried to look away, but her eyes were fixed on the mirror, unable to move. The pain began to spread through her body, starting as a mild burning and quickly growing into unbearable agony. It was as if something was pulling every piece of her humanity, every trace of life, leaving only an empty shell. The old woman laughed, a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "This is the price of your trust, my dear. You gave away what was most precious, your soul, and now you're trapped here, with me, forever." With those words, the darkness finally engulfed Sarah completely, and the mirror in her hands shattered, scattering pieces of her distorted reflection across the floor. But Sarah saw none of this, for her consciousness had already been pulled into a place where neither light nor hope could reach. The price of her trust had been too high, and now there was nothing left but an empty presence, echoing eternally in that dark room. In the suffocating silence that followed the darkness, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. The shadows, which before seemed like passive observers, now moved with a sinister purpose, as if responding to a silent call. The old woman, with a smile of pure triumph, leaned over the broken mirror, gathering the fragments with agile and experienced hands. She carefully arranged them on the table, forming a pattern that seemed to glow with a faint, almost invisible light, but which radiated an ancient and malevolent power. "Look, my dear," the old woman whispered, though Sarah could no longer hear her words. "The cycle is complete, and what was promised will be fulfilled." With a swift motion, the old woman ran the blade across her own hand, letting the blood drip onto the mirror shards. The blood, upon touching the fragments, began to bubble, as if it were alive, and the images reflected in them began to change. Sarah's face, once a picture of pure terror, began to contort into an expression of deep suffering and despair, but also of acceptance. It was as if, deep down, she knew this was her fate from the moment she offered help to that stranger. And then, the truth was revealed. The shadows around them began to solidify, taking on human forms, but their features were distorted, twisted by pain and despair. They were the souls of others who, like Sarah, had trusted the old woman and paid the price with their lives. Now they were trapped in that place, condemned to repeat the cycle, to serve as silent witnesses to each new victim who fell into the trap. The old woman laughed, but now her laugh was accompanied by a chorus of voices from the shadows, a dark lament that echoed off the walls. "Welcome to my home," she said, turning to face the shadows. "You have a new companion. Take good care of her." With those words, the shadows advanced, engulfing Sarah's body, which no longer had the strength to resist. She felt her essence being ripped from her body, pulled into the void, where it would be consumed slowly, eternally. And in that final moment, the revelation took shape in her mind. The old woman was not just a cursed woman. She was the evil itself, an ancient entity that fed on the trust and despair of her victims, trapping them in an endless cycle of terror. Sarah, now part of the shadows, understood the extent of her mistake, but it was already too late. She was trapped, condemned to wander that place, watching as the old woman lured the next naive soul who dared offer help to a stranger. The darkness enveloped Sarah completely, but her torment was far from over. Within that endless abyss, she became aware of the suffering of the other souls that inhabited that place, each one a shadow of what they once were, lost and trapped in the eternity of a malevolent cycle. The voices of the shadows, now companions in her fate, murmured incessantly, laden with lamentations and muffled screams, forming a cacophony of despair that would never find peace. And then, something happened that broke the cycle for a brief moment. The old woman, the dark creature who had imprisoned her, approached Sarah one last time, with that cruel smile etched on her face. "You have something that belongs to me," she said, with a voice that was both a whisper and a thunderclap. The knife blade, still stained with the ancient blood of countless victims, glowed under the candlelight, now more intense, as if fueled by the pain that permeated the environment. The old woman leaned over Sarah, who was now no more than a weak shadow, an echo of her former self. With a quick and precise movement, she stabbed the knife into Sarah's chest, and in that instant, everything stopped. The world around Sarah dissolved into a spiral of darkness and pulsing lights, and for a moment, she felt as if she were being freed. But it was only a cruel illusion. What happened next was worse than any torture she could have imagined. She did not die. On the contrary, Sarah's essence was ripped from her shadowy body and fused with the cold metal of the knife, where she would feel every cut, every drop of blood spilled, as if it were her own flesh. The old woman raised the knife, now glowing with a sinister light, and smiled. "Welcome to true torment, my dear. Now you will serve my purpose forever." Sarah then woke up from a deep sleep, lying in her bed, in the middle of the night, unsure if everything she had experienced was real or a pure nightmare. Her reflection made her quickly look at her chest and try to check if she had a wound where she had been stabbed. And although there was no wound, she felt a strong... Sarah was imprisoned in the knife, in the disturbing game that the old woman had included her in, and she could see the outside world again, now through a distorted and macabre lens. She was broken inside and obsessed with understanding what had happened. Sarah went to the police to file a report, and when she arrived at the house, she remembered with the officers. The house had been abandoned for a long time with no signs of life. So she decided to wander the night through the same stretch where she found the old woman, night after night, searching for something unknown. In her dreams, she helplessly watched as the old woman continued her cycle of horror, using the knife to lure and destroy more victims, feeding on their souls and condemning them to a fate worse than death. Her mind now disturbed and blindly entangled in a cycle of horror, Sarah tried desperately to find the old woman, her house, and break this unsettling scenario that enveloped her. Sarah wanted to go back to being the sweet and kind young woman she once was, a shadow of her past. Then she had an idea. She would lure someone to where she remembered, the old woman's house, who would never refuse, and so she could prove that she wasn't going crazy. She spent a few days waiting for the perfect moment. On a waning moon night, old and grim, Sarah went to the same street where she first met the old woman and saw a young man walking quickly through the empty streets of the city. "Could you help me with something, dear?" she asked, her voice soft as silk while her mind was in turmoil. Refused, and at that moment, Sarah crumbled. Why didn't he accept? And like a drop that overflows a full glass, she went insane. Sarah was admitted to a psychiatric hospital where her story was recorded. Every night, the old woman entered Sarah's room to contemplate the abyss of madness in which she found herself. The doctors and nurses witnessed scenes of pure horror. Sarah, once a kind and radiant young woman, would scream in terror and pain, always claiming that she had been stabbed in the chest, only to faint from the overwhelming fear. She relived this nightmare day after day, as if trapped in an endless loop of suffering. On another waning moon night, exhausted from reliving the same torment, Sarah made a fateful decision. After dinner, she stole a knife from one of the trays meant for another patient. Without hesitation, she plunged it into her chest. The pain was something she was all too familiar with. But as she lay dying, she began to laugh, an eerie, unsettling laugh. "I won. I'm free. Now I'm free," she repeated, her voice a twisted echo of her former self. But true freedom was elusive. Sarah's death did not bring her the peace she sought. Instead, it only deepened the nightmare she was already living. Her soul, now fully intertwined with the cursed knife, became another piece in the old woman's sinister collection. And so the cycle continued, eternally, with each new soul providing a fresh feast of despair for the ancient creature, while Sarah and the other trapped souls watched helplessly, condemned to relive the horror over and over again, with no end in sight. If you've made it this far, it means you love that spine-tingling feeling, that tension in the air, and the kind of fear that grips you until the very last second. Stories like this one are just the beginning of what we have in store for you. If the darkness, the unknown, and the unexplainable fascinate you, then you're in the right place. Don't let fear be the end of your journey. Subscribe to the channel and follow our next terrifying stories. We promise to take you even deeper into the darkness, where every sound, every shadow could be the start of a new nightmare. Join us if you dare and discover what truly lurks in the shadows. And remember, be careful who you help. You never know what might be hiding behind a smile.